It's a pleasure to be able to report on a classical over-the-board chess tournament. Proper time control, proper players, proper tournament. The Tata Steel tournament has begun on the Dutch coast, this traditional tournament, and the organisers have put together a really interesting field as ever. We have the world number one, Magnus Carlsen, the world number two, Fabiano Caruana. Then we have a mix of experienced and very young players as well. It is my favourite tournament of the year, and I'm just delighted that the organisers have managed to put together, well, not a whole congress as usual, but the elite tournament at the very least. So round one, we have the pairing of Magnus Carlsen against the 17-year-old Alireza Firouzja. So Firouzja had quite a breakthrough tournament in the Tata Steel tournament last year. He scored 50%, which was pretty extraordinary for a 16-year-old. And, well, since then we've been following him online, of course. And, well, even in Norway Chess, he played a classical tournament, an over-the-board tournament, and did very well. He came second. So what would happen? An intriguing first-round pairing. Carlsen with white, it's Queen's Gambit. Oh yeah, just for information, remember last year that Carlsen actually crushed Firouzja in their classical game in the Tata Steel tournament. An absolutely beautiful game by Carlsen. So could Firouzja improve on that? So it's a kind of Queen's Gambit with this early knight d7, and an e3 would be pretty normal, but Carlsen decides to turn it into a kind of exchange variation, except he's left it a bit late to exchange on d5. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, pawn takes pawn leads to absolutely normal Queen's Gambit exchange variation position. But because the bishop is already on g5 and the bishop on e7, then that gives black the chance to recapture with the knight and exchange pieces. And that's certainly in black's favour so often in the Queen's Gambit. If black can exchange those dark squared bishops, it leaves the queen with a good square to go to on e7. And that means that, for example, the rooks can be connected at an early stage. It just frees black's pieces, this exchange. e4 from Carlsen. So knight takes c3, b takes c3, and now we have a position which is rather like a semi-Tarrasch. Basically the same structure. But this is a semi-Tarrasch which I think is actually more favourable to black, because I think black is basically developing quicker. Pieces are very harmoniously placed, so I don't think black should have any difficulties in this position at all, actually. So Carlsen went for a4. Well, it's a good idea to try to weaken these pawns, to isolate a pawn here. a5. So the standard little minority attack against these pawns. So he's bound to create an isolated pawn. But this is still absolutely fine for black. Shouldn't be a problem. And Firouzja begins to put pressure on this pawn. This is typical strategy for this variation. And white has something of a dilemma here. You don't want to advance, because that will give the knight a beautiful square on d5. Let's just look at that. That knight is just such a fantastic piece, and it doesn't really grant white any particular attacking chances with the pawn here. There is this typical attacking idea, d5, and then e5, to block out this bishop. But here, well, the knight is pretty well placed on e4. We've seen Carlsen do this before against Giri in a similar position. and then blockade with the knight on d4. But here, of course, well, it's not possible because the e-pawn is dropping. So that typical pawn sacrifice isn't really working at the moment. So for the time being, Carlsen has to just protect that pawn, rook e1. And rook d8, just a little bit more pressure here. Queen a1, the queen comes over, supporting the rook, and a bit of pressure on a7. Queen c7, good move. In fact, it's not necessary to protect the pawn. The queen activates, and it's ready to come into f4, as we'll see in a moment. And if rook takes, let's just have a very quick look at this. In fact, taking this pawn doesn't give white the advantage, because after this, the queen has to come back. Queens can be exchanged, and then rook c8 is going to pick up that pawn. If the rook comes across, then that pawn could be taken. Basically, black is going to pick up that pawn, and e5, well, it's just an ugly move. Knight here is possible, even knight d5, I think it would be possible, actually. So, basically, taking the pawn doesn't lead to any advantage for white. So Carlsen just makes sure that his back rank is, well, means there aren't going to be problems there. So his king has potentially an escape square on h3. a6. So it means, well, if bishop takes pawn, then of course that can be taken. Rook c5. Hitting the queen, which comes to f4. So a little bit more pressure on that pawn. Knight, queen and bishop all hitting the pawn on e5. Carlsen protects with the rook. It's kind of an ungainly move, I have to say. In any case, Firouzja decides to simply expel the rook straight away, and it goes back to a5. And the knight comes back to f6. They're repeating the position. Rook e5, I think, would probably just lead to a draw by repetition. Basically, that would contain the position for white, but obviously, black can just repeat. So, how should Carlsen try to play for a win? It's not easy. There's a little interesting move here, g3, which would be nice if the queen went backwards, but actually I suspect that queen takes knight might have been played. And although black's queen is trapped, I think this would lead to a position which is probably just a draw, because I don't think that white is going to be able to make progress in this position. Something like this, well, it might even be possible to take this pawn, but even if the knight just dropped back here, black is too compact for white to make any progress in that position. So I don't think g3 helps white in this position. Still don't like e5. That looks really ugly. Well, I mean, it's probably possible just to take here. So what would Carlsen do? Accept a draw with rook e5? No, not his style. He took a risk. d5. Now this starts to look like a blitz game. Pawn takes pawn, e5. So as I said, we've seen this typical strategic sacrifice actually in many games with this kind of pawn structure. And Carlsen played it last year against Geary and won a beautiful game. This one isn't quite as convincing because the queen stands in a very good position. That knight looks pretty strong on e4, protected by bishop and pawn. The knight can't blockade on d4 because that pawn will probably drop. Well, in this position anyway, f2 drops, of course. That's the problem at the moment. But in any case, it's hard to achieve that. Well, Carlsen blockades with the queen, so rather different to the game against Geary. The queen covers f2, blockades the d pawns. That means that the bishop is shut in. So that's not a bad start, but it still seems a bit, although white is struggling to prove compensation here. Black's kingside looks better protected than usual in with this kind of strategic sacrifice. Rook comes to c8, looking to play rook c1, and then, well, after exchanging rooks, I'm sure black is fine there. So Carlsen dropped the rook back to a1, covering that c1 square, connecting the rooks. You all know I like that, so that's good. But it does allow that pawn to advance. So why not? Let's try and get that pawn forward. Rook b1. Carlsen hits the bishop. And this is a big moment for Firouzja. What do you do? Do you maintain that bishop on this diagonal, protecting that knight? Or do you play bishop a6? Now that's a compromise, because it would allow white to take and then take on d5. So white would get the pawn back with a little bit of initiative. Now bishop a6 is a safer move. Bishop c6 kind of keeps that extra pawn. So that's the ambitious move, and that's what Firouzja did. So how does white make progress? Well, Carlsen decided to sacrifice pawn number 2, e6. It's a beautiful move. And then threw the knight into e5, threatening f3, winning that knight because there's a pin here. So the queen dropped back to f6. So Carlsen 2 pawns down now. Does feel like a kind of blitz game, actually, where Carlsen just decides, right, I'm going for it. And in fact, Firouzja was running short of time. Certainly had much less time than Carlsen. Now here again, if Carlsen wants to keep a lid on things, wants to maybe make a draw, then he doesn't have to gamble here. He could exchange and then exchange here and take that pawn. Now he's only 1 pawn down here, but well, one feels that with this weak pawn, white's pieces on good squares, should be a draw. But no, that's not why he sacked these 2 pawns in the first place. He's playing on f3, driving the knight back. Now what? Well, you've got to keep the initiative here. From a strategic point of view, it looks absolutely wonderful for white. But Carlsen is 2 pawns down. Rook b6 hits the bishop, which came back. And now, basically, black's threat is to drop the knight back to f7, to challenge the knight on e5, and force an exchange. Then it's going to be really hard for white to prove compensation. There's this pin here. So that's why Carlsen dropped the queen to e3. So he's had to almost take a sort of time out before he moves forward. So this is really risky. And here, well, queen e7 is possible. h5 is possible, covering g4. And it's not easy to see how white makes progress there. After the game continuation, a4, this also looks very worrying for white. That pawn is now getting dangerously close to the queening square. Knight g4 from Carlsen. The queen goes back. Now, I suspect that Firouzja underestimated white's next move. Rook takes pawn. So Carlsen understands he has to just go for it. And, well, this is starting to look really menacing. Maybe rook e7 coming. I mean, my computer thinks that a3 is still possible for black here and should be better for black. But that is very, very scary after rook e7. But apparently black is okay after a3, rook e7, bishop f7. But It's starting to look pretty tricky now. Firouzja decided to take on e6, and that really is risky. Queen takes e6 check. And here came the fatal error from black. He's still okay if he plays king h8, and then after knight h6, well, you have to make some only moves to survive this. I mean, this already looks terrifying with basically all white pieces in the attack and the king looking like he needs some friends, basically. And here it's, well, black can only survive with only moves. Well, the bishop h5 is apparently the only move to survive. It still looks very scary. I mean, very hard to see in any kind of game, blitz, rapid or classical. But bishop f7 was definitely the final mistake. And here Carlsen crashed in. Knight takes pawn check. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes h6, threatening bishop h7, which will force mate. Okay, let's just show that very quickly. Here, it's a classic mating sequence. There we go. That's the threat. So this bishop has to be protected. Therefore, queen c7. But queen h7 forces mate anyway. Watch this. King f8. Queen h8 check. Bishop goes in the way, and then queen h6 was the final move. Here, Firouzja resigned. If the king steps up, then bishop g6 forces mate in a couple of moves, and, well, otherwise queen g7 check, and mate ends the game. Or king f7 also mate with queen e7. Wow. What a finish from Carlsen. But what daring strategy. Yes, we've seen this idea of d5 before in these kind of semi-Tarrasch positions. But then there was something so elegant about this second pawn sacrifice, e6. With these beautiful blockaders on e5 and d4. And even after that, very difficult to prove compensation. But, well, Carlsen crashed through with a splendid initiative. Wow, what a game. And Carlsen, who described himself as being in a deep funk after the latest after he crashed out of the latest online tournament, well, that will certainly lift his spirits. What a way to start a tournament. Well, more coming from the Tata Steel tournament over the next couple of weeks. It is a fantastic event. Giri won a splendid game in round one today. Anyway, more coming your way soon. Thanks for watching.